şəfa təhi piyaləsi. Son oturumu Sayın Cemal Nurhan'ın başka Türk kadın değerli üyeleri bu celallı, bu şükürlü meclisi tertip ettikleri için tekrar teşekkür ederim. İnşallah bu son oturumda bizden önceki oturumlar gibi değerli olacak ve iyi bilgiler bize sunacak. Birinci konuşmacımız Sayın Prof.Dr. James Morris.
Before we begin, I want to first of all begin with thanks. That seems appropriate and a tradition where shukr is so central. To begin with, to the sort of corporate sponsors, Mayor's Culture and the municipality, but above all to TÜRKKAD and especially to Jalal and really to all the members of the group, not as a group, but as individuals. This is the 34th of your conferences that I've been privileged to come to, and each time I come away with just additional warmth and love for Istanbul, at least the dervishes of Turkey. My title, by the way, I'm just looking to see if the English is going to appear there. My title is actually different. That was the one I gave months ago when they first asked us to respond, and I wasn't sure how much time I had to spend researching on Sultan Veled. So the actual title is Communication and Creativity, in the sense of Ehsan, Sultan Veled and the Challenges of Spiritual Inheritance, or Waratha. And I should also, again, I don't know whether they're going to show the English. I should explain that this paper, I've shortened it by about 1/3 so that it would fit into the 15-minute time frame. And of course, that means that I'm going to feel pressure because I know the vast majority of people here want me to simply get out of the way so we can all listen to Jamal Morhoja as quickly as possible. But so I'm going to speed this up, but I have a wonderful excuse this time because we all know from sort of practical physics that let's assume that I'm a moth. And when you have a great ambience to fly around in, around your flame, then of course you go very slowly when you're at a distance. And so I wrote a very stately paper that would take much longer than the 50 minutes it turns out we have. But as you can all see, when one comes very close to the site of the light here, like a good moth, I'm very close to Jabal Nur, and so I just naturally speed up as I get closer and closer to the flame, like so many people here. So that's my excuse for feeling just the same desire that I'm sure many of you do to get through this quickly so we can move ahead to the next two talks in Turkish. Let me just explain, because the title is different. I should also actually put in a nutshell what I was wrestling with in this paper, and I know Carl was and some of the others, is the paradox of spiritual inheritance in absolutely any tradition I know of in the world, whether it be people we call prophets or those we call saints or awliya. You have this paradox of success where the institutionalization, the systematization of a particular, in the following generations, a particular spiritual influence, especially a powerful one on the world, means that the tradition becomes a tradition, lives on, but at the same time its very success limits other possibilities. And this is certainly wonderfully evident in Rumi's poetry, which continues to have this universal dimension. In so many ways it can be lived and experienced and acted. And of course, we're looking at this weekend at a very successful, historically successful part of that. So when I make a comparison here between similar developments to Sultan Veled's time, because when you go back in history, you always discover that the first 1 or 2 generations, everything is read back from later, subsequent centuries back to the time of the generation following the prophet and the saint. And as I began to study more, especially the Aflaki's hagiography, I was struck by how unsystematic still, how much more on a level of master-disciple relationship both the poetry of Sultan Veled was, and actually also the anecdotes that Aflaki tells about him. So my point here is really not the historical comparison I'll briefly indulge in, but what you do discover when you go back in time, ascending towards the time of the prophet and saint, in fact, far from becoming microscopic like a pointillist painting where all I'm going to see is points. What you actually see when you look at spiritual transformation and spiritual communication in real life, around real people, is that you leave history behind, and what becomes more and more evident is the invisible, as I say here, that spiritual education, spiritual communication is always involved a silent partner. And I'll mention the famous part of the Hadith of Gabriel about defining this ability to recognize what is needed and respond to what is good and beautiful. I should probably just say that the Ihsan is defined there as worshiping and serving God as though you see Him, for even if you do not see Him, He sees you. And of course, the same Arabic words can also be read and worship God as though you see Him. And if you are not, you do see Him, and He sees you. So that the invisibility of the real actor in this play, or the central actor in this play, ceases to be so invisible when we actually look at the spiritual cases of people around us. And also, one additional advantage is there, we cease to think in terms of sects and groups and religions, and discover God's presence and God's actions and God's hand and God's nazar, and the presence of the Allah in absolutely everywhere on the planet at all times. So, to start with the paper now, it doesn't look like it's going to appear in English. Whoever's translating will have to follow what we've cut out here, but hopefully you can follow me in the Turkish. The extraordinary life and lasting institutional achievements of Sultan Veled and other early Mevlevis detailed in this conference are an inspiring reminder of the ongoing challenges that we all face as heirs who are responsible for rightly fulfilling the immense heritage of the prophets and all of the friends of God. This universal understanding of spiritual inheritance is perhaps most fully elaborated in the writings of Ibn Arabi, and richly exemplified in the centuries-long dramatic historical influence of his own remarkable heir and contemporary of both Rumi and Sultan Veled, Sadruddin Konya. Indeed, one of the most historically prophetic, that is, predicting the future, in English is the prophetic stories, Aflaki's and his family hagiography, the Manaqib al-Arifin, comes at the very end of his chapter on Sultan Veled. There he recounts how at a funeral at the time of Sultan Veled, one of those attending was shocked by the use of reciters of Persian ghazals of Rumi as part of the funeral proceedings for one of his followers, so that this critic attempted to prevent the attendees from singing those heartfelt, joyful songs of love and devotion. As Aflaki reports this incident, suddenly Veled arrived and remarked, "Why are our reciters not reciting and expressing joy at the encounter with the spirits and the angel paradise?" At the same time, he clasped his critic's hand and said, "The foundation of this practice was laid by a very great man, and he allowed it. A greater man is required to do away with this custom and change it. This state of affairs will not be eliminated among the lovers until the day of resurrection. Why do you upset yourself and give yourself trouble and hurl yourself against the friends of God?" Aflaki then continues, explaining how some of the Sufi masters present took this dispute to the Sheikh al-Islam, the chief religio-juridical authority of the city, and none other than Sadruddin Konya, who gave the following response. This is still quoted from Konya from Manaqib. "Right is on the side of our master, Sultan Veled, and it is as he said. verily good innovation, the hasana, from the famous hadith, on the part of the friends of God, is equal to the customary practice of the prophets. Doing away with this is among the impossibilities. Indeed, this final exchange, not only spontaneous and formal fatwa, in many ways prefigure fundamental features of the ensuing transformation of Islam into a truly world religion, rapidly spreading throughout all of Asia, or might add the Balkans, in the immediately following centuries, in creative, locally adapted ways, which are almost always justified in theological frameworks traceable back to Konya and to his teacher, Ibn Arabi. Those key institutional innovations, whose initial historical stages in Anatolia are often beautifully illustrated throughout Aflaki's work and his sources, would certainly include the following. I'll just run through these quickly. The widespread use of popular vernacular devotional lyric poetry, along with locally adapted musical traditions and often forms of movement or dance, in ceremonies of dhikr and many other religious and devotional contexts, including those everywhere related to the shrines of the Friends of God. Secondly, the almost universal development and endowment of the tomb shrines of the Friends and the immense range of devotional practices, festivals, and other rituals of visitation, of ziyarat, and pilgrimage connected with those shrines. Third, the institutionalization, including the endowment of particular places of worship and devotion, of a multitude of formal sort of Sufi paths, tariqas or turuq, each with their particular institutions, spiritual techniques, and devotional rituals. I'll pause every now and then to make sure the English is caught, the Turkish is caught up. The learned Arabic, the next one, the learned Arabic theological and philosophical defense and explanation of the foundations, validity, and centrality of those practices in terms of the existing complex and traditional religious sciences, which was, of course, largely elaborated in terms we can trace back to the foundational writings of Ibn Arabi and Qadwi. Fifth, the local institutional frameworks of political and economic endowment and support of all the above developments, which are again vividly illustrated throughout the later sections of Aflaki's and its work. Within a few centuries, of course, these transformative developments, which you can see so clearly unfolding during the lifetime and historical setting of Sultan Veled and the nascent Mevlevi movement, have become so pervasive and so extraordinarily successful as these newly created Islamic humanities coincided with the rapid expansion of Muslim identities and the widespread creative unfolding of Islamic civilization and cultures throughout so much of Asia, that they rapidly became the essential features of both popular and high cultures, Muslim cultures, far beyond the historical confines of the earlier Arab invasions, in those widely scattered regions where the vast majority of the world's Muslims have lived since at least the 15th and 16th centuries. But even a cursory acquaintance with Sultan Veled's near contemporary and virtual neighbor, Ibn Taymiyyah, should suggest just how widespread and vehement the reaction of Aflaki's hostile funeral goer to these transformational innovations was in other settings already at that time, and how the issues highlighted in Aflaki's account continue to resonate everywhere today. Of course, in some periods, and at the start of each individual's path, we may imagine ourselves to be simply consumers or mere users of spiritual forms and institutions we naively take for granted. But particularly in times of rapid global transformations like our own, which have so closely mirrored the tumultuous conditions of Sultan Veled's historical situation and the immediately following centuries, none of us can avoid being quickly drawn into essentially the same types of conditions and challenges which faced each of Rumi's earlier heirs and disciples. First, recognizing particular spiritual needs. Second, responding creatively with appropriate forms of effective spiritual communication, ihsan. And third, discovering at each occasion the deeper lessons, that is, the implications, opportunities, and limitations of both success and failure at each step of this way. So rather than dwelling here in the social and cultural history of Sultan Veled and his time, I should like to look more closely at the ways that these dynamics of spiritual creativity and innovation, so visible at that time, have recently been so vividly repeated in the ongoing popularization and cultural familiarization with Rumi's works in the English language world. While a few of our speakers in this setting and other attendees here are quite familiar with this ongoing cultural process and indeed have played key personal roles in it. I would like to begin this section, and well, tonight I'll certainly stick to it, by mentioning, as Aflaki often does, a representative set of a few individual anecdotal moments in this process that I've directly witnessed, since effective spiritual communication is always a retail, necessarily individual phenomenon, and one that always includes a third silent partner, as in the Hadith of Jibreel. Then we can conclude by generalizing from those particular observations to isolate some of the ways in which the gradual unfolding of Rumi's influences in new settings in our own days so often closely parallels many of the lastingly influential developments we find taking place with Sultan Veled and his followers and immediate descendants. Like almost anyone limited to English until very recently, my first encounter with Rumi as a young university student was through the pioneering literal English translations of Nicholson and later A.J. Arbery. In recent decades, we witnessed the creation of many essential scholarly tools for specialists or scholars' understanding of the context and meaning of Rumi's poetic works, from concordances and the indispensable source studies of Firouz Anfar and more recent scholars of different nations, to Simon Wakeman's epical study of the organizing structures of the entire Masnavi. Indeed, many of these recent tools in other languages closely parallel the needs and functions of the famous later Ottoman commentaries and their translations into other Islamic languages that were used throughout the Eastern Islamic world. But it is also very clear that the initial short volumes of very creative retranslations by the accomplished poet Goldman Parks reached a vastly wider audience than any of those earlier efforts in English, opening the door to virtually all the subsequent developments we can only briefly mention here. Simply in comparing these two very different forms of translation and their different relative audiences, it is easy to see how the creative unfolding of the Islamic humanities in the centuries following Sultan Veled proceeded above all through the ongoing creative recreation of such already classical Persian poetic and musical forms in the vernacular languages, beginning with Turkish, of new regions and cultures. I'm skipping over Johnny Appleseed here. Very colorful image though. One crucial dimension of this creative rediscovery of Rumi is musical, epitomized in Shahram Nasri's first widely distributed tape of unidentified and untranslated quatrains distributed in English under the Night Songs of Rumi, whose emotional intensity so fascinated me at first listening that I spent weeks carefully identifying and translating these short poems for my own students. Here again, I was surprised at the way students' initial encounter with only a few of these songs or simple Persian recitations, often without any translation or explanation, was sufficient to suddenly motivate them to take up the study of Persian, and of course, eventually of more of Rumi's and other Persian Sufi poetry on their own time, motivated by a passionate and highly productive burst of ishq, rarely witnessed in any ordinary language course. As with Parks's translations, Nasri's music and recitation helped open the doors to global audiences for many other traditional Iranian musicians, Parisa, Shajari, and many others, and eventually for Sufi and among them Mevlevi performers from a host of other Muslim cultures and traditions, many of whom have since become central figures in world musical culture, unimaginable only a few decades earlier. Just briefly in the paper, I go on to mention the ritual and visual dimensions of the Mevlevi heritage, things that you can now access very readily on the internet, but at the time mention some of the short films and books which are so important, and visiting the Samazans and so forth that first brought these to this dimension of Rumi to audiences in the West. So as a reflection, so I mentioned music, ritual, visual sides, and the actual works, translations of the poetry. As a reflection of the naturally expansive flow of genuine spiritual communication, attentive readers of Aflaki's enormous memorial to Rumi and his spiritual descendants cannot help but notice the dramatic contrast between his stories of Sultan Veled, still almost entirely restricted to Konya, Kayseri, and the regional circle of Rumi's own original followers and disciples and visitors, and the following longer chapter on Sultan Veled's son Chalabi Amir Arif, whose frequent travels and vigorous proselytization take him or his own students far into the neighboring Ilkhanate and Mamluk realms, as well as all of Anatolia, marking a noticeably distinct new stage in Rumi's growing influence. A second phase, a wider expansion, is mirrored, of course, in the manifest historical inheritance of every prophet and historically influential wadi. Likewise, the corresponding extent to the past 3 decades of rapidly spreading public awareness of Rumi in North America and increasingly globally, that made of him a recent spiritual and cultural figure far beyond the earlier small circles of interested scholars, recent immigrants, or Sufi devotees. The extent to which Rumi had become a wider cultural figure was brought home to me in a recent nationwide radio program in America during the Year of Rumi a few years back, where listeners were asked to call in with their own personal stories of how Rumi had influenced their lives. I have to skip this paragraph, although it's the real heart of the paper, because the point is that nobody who called in was either Muslim for the most part or a Sufi, and yet their stories dramatically illustrated the ways in which, well, I'll mention the first one, that they were all so memorable, but a student at a local Protestant seminary in Boston called in to say how the theology students there, he had students in Protestant tradition, tired of the often boring and dry context of their regular academic studies, would turn to gather together weekly in the evening to share and discuss and amacına, their favorite Rumi poems and passages, which helped weekly to revive their own deeper spiritual and religious vocations and motivations. And the first one I called in was even more amazing, was some woman from somewhere in the South who told of sharing the poems of Rumi to help ease the passing, suffering, and fears of death of her aunt, who was an elderly Holocaust survivor. So as these calls streamed in from around the country, primarily from non-Muslim callers from non-academic or non-Sufi settings, one could not have asked for a more dramatic and consistent illustration of the secret confluence of individual human testing situations and grace that always underlies the mystery of spiritual influences and effective spiritual communication. And I'm concluding here. Now, what is surely most striking when one examines these few representative contemporary stories, just as we find in reading Aflaki's own stories of Sultan Veled and his companions and family, is that they are not centered on the profound study of Rumi's works, much less in the practice of a Mevlevi or any other spiritual path, as we would normally, by study, I think the kind of study we would normally carefully devote to the scriptures or works of more abstract religious philosophy and wisdom in any tradition. Instead, such stories, in their thousand-fold multiples, faithfully reflect the spiritually decisive role of beauty, whether it be beauty of aesthetic form, or the even more mysterious charismatic presence and solace of the friend of the wadi, al-wadi, remember the divine name, not just the saints, and of the deeply rooted love and spiritual motivation that beauty immediately inspires and awakens, along with the awakened communion and communities of love. The lovers, remember in the first story, that spontaneously flow from that shared inspiration and awareness. The positive keynote of Aflaki's actual description of each of Rumi's true heirs is one of ongoing celebration and thankful remembrance of Shuk and Dhikr. And it would seem that that observation applies just as much today with this contemporary and now globally expanding heritage. For whether a person has initially been drawn into that spiritual ambience by an encounter with Rumi's translated poetry, with related spiritual music, or with a charismatic spiritual teacher, or with other ritual and aesthetic aspects of the wider Mevlevi tradition, this sort of more immediate spiritual contact involves a naturally contagious enthusiasm which is directly accessible and as spontaneously effective today as it was in the time of Sultan Veled. As we have seen, the available vehicles for conveying and renewing Rumi's heritage for effective spiritual communication and creativity, or if you will, for true remembrance of God, keeping in mind, Allah, it's by the calming the peace of the hearts that we know that's the true remembrance of God. That the vehicles for that were already effective and visible for his immediate heirs like Sultan Veled. And they are apparently not that different today. Beautiful translations, music, movement, shared rituals, communal remembrance, charismatic transmitters and teachers, or tools for deeper individual study and wider institutional support. All of these things are constantly recounted in Afaki. Against that backdrop, Mevlana's reported words to his young son, Sultan Veled, continue to challenge every lover of his poetry, of his words, even in translation, and their intoxicating music, whether as a request, as a deeper intention, or perhaps even as a commandment. This is something that a number of speakers have already alluded to, but it becomes more powerful each time I go back to it. It's really caressing the young infant, Sultan Veled, and he says, "My coming into this world is for the sake of your appearance, for all these words of mine. All these words of mine are my speech, whereas you are my action." Thank you. Aşk olsun.